Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm very honored and privileged to have this guest on, somebody I've been in touch with since last fall, and probably would have had him on sooner if it wasn't for a couple tornadoes that came through our place here in Florida, and then my mom breaking her hip. But last summer, August of last year, um, this letter came out, this or an answer to the CES letter came out, called the Light and Truth Letter by Austin Fife. And it's a response to the CES letter, but also a response to general criticisms that are directed towards the church and its claims. And you have a very interesting story. I've put it out there on Reddit, some questions. So I just want to let everybody know on the Mormon Reddit that I'm going to probably ask a couple questions that were asked in that group as well. And I've been in touch with Kolby Reddish and had some conversations with him. Of course, I'm good friends with Radio Free Mormon. And of course, they've been doing some work on their program about the work. And I'm actually going to invite Austin to even respond to, if he wants to some of those critiques that have been made about his work. But before we do that, I actually want us to get to know Austin a little better. Austin, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Steve. Sorry this took so long to coordinate our schedules, but I'm glad to be here.
I am so glad it's worked out the way it has. So, Austin, I just before we get into the letter, I want you to kind of just talk about your past. Like, were you born in the covenant? Did you serve a mission? Maybe talk a little bit about your history in the church, and then about around circa 2014, you actually had a faith crisis. So I'd want to kind of lead into that as well. But before you
Sure.
get to the faith crisis, I just want us to give us a little background story.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's another program podcast that I went into a lot of detail about kind of my story and my history. Hasn't come out yet, and I don't push podcasters, hey, when are you going to upload the episode? I just let them do their thing. And so yeah, maybe you send this out and that one will come right after. You'll be first. But yeah, I born and raised in the covenant in the church. I'm from the Seattle, Washington area. Yeah, I don't know how important this is, but grew up in like a low income neighborhood, low income elementary, middle school, high school, pretty rough. Not upbringing in my own home necessarily. My mom, since her 30s, has been an on and off drug addict. Started with opioids and then led to progressively harder and harder things. And anyone who's dealt with that knows the impact that can have on a family, on a community. Um, I say all that because I was a huge beneficiary of the church. I am thoroughly convinced I'd be in a very different place without the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, even in my darkest, lowest faith crisis moments, there's anger that you feel when you feel like you've been betrayed, you've been lied to.
Hmm.
But I always had this sense of gratitude, even if I was going to step away for having been raised in the church, because I think I would have turned out very different and not in a good way. So, everything good in my life, this is circa 2014. I felt like almost everything good in my life was thanks to, the gospel grounding my family, through it all, even through some, pretty hairy times. And so it's a little bit of my background. In the Light and Truth letter, I kind of skim over my story a little bit because that's not necessarily the most important part, or frankly, even the most interesting part. I think lots of people have a faith crisis. I don't think I'm like particularly unique or special, or my story is particularly cool or anything like that. But I describe in the letter how my faith crisis was gradual and then all at once. And I know you were atheist agnostic for years. I don't know how it came on for you, if it was kind of similar.
Yeah, it was an accumulation and then a sudden
Yeah.
loss of faith. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
why actually I really one of the reasons I want to have you on the program is actually one of the reasons when I first heard your story, I really wanted to kind of delve into this a little bit more
Yeah.
because I read that resonated with me.
Yeah.
Like I thought, what would it look like if I, lost my faith and then came back into faith and then wrote a book defending Christianity, and I was kind of looking at you as kind of like what would that look like? So
Right.
so when you say what was some of the stuff that up until the 2014 moment, what were some of the things that were kind of making your shelf heavy that were maybe causing you to question things?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan. In fact, I didn't understand my faith crisis, I think, completely till maybe 5 years ago. Have you ever heard of, he's a BYU, Idaho professor of philosophy, Jeffrey Thane?
That
Are
name
you
rings
familiar?
a bell, but I can't say much more than that. Yeah.
So his big shtick, he has a like philosophy blog. He's written a couple of books. The one that I like is called "Who Is Truth." But his whole shtick, and he's presented at fair as well, is worldview apologetics, where and it wasn't until encountering his, I think, 2019 or 2020 fair conference speech that I finally like clicked, like,
Hmm.
how did this happen? And I think what happened is over the years, just the waters I was swimming in, right? The cultural waters uh, gradually were changing. And so my lens in which I interpreted the world was slowly becoming more and more secular. Uh, it wasn't this active decision. It was more just the subtle change in how I was seeing things and seeing the world. And sometimes it would pop up, like my wife and I would talk about something, and it was clear we felt really different about something, even though we're both Latter-day Saints, even though we're both born in the covenant, raised in the church. And so it was this real gradual thing where just my spiritual taste buds, that's another phrase that Jeffrey Thane uses, was changing over time. And so in the years and months leading up to the end of 2013, I started following some atheist groups. I started listening to critics. And I probably at the time, if you would have asked me, it would have said, I want to know what the critics are saying so I could fight back or whatever. It's probably what I told myself.
Okay, okay. And I think this is really important. And again, you're looking back at it, and sometimes you're also looking through a
Sure.
filter and a prism
Correct.
after
Yeah,
that
probably.
too. So we have to take that into account as well. But for me, I started kind of a similar thing where I was like, okay, there's all these great apologists are out there. They're doing this great work defending the church and defending the faith. And so I picked up a copy of this book, Josh McDowell's The New Evidence That Demands the Verdict. And I read this book, I started reading it, and my shelves got heavy right away when I started reading this book. So it was actually Christian apologetics that caused
Mm,
me to head into an atheist direction.
yeah.
So then, once I started deconstructing my faith, I started engaging atheism and also science and biology and evolution.
Right.
Really started educating myself on the subject. So I just want to give you kind of where I was at in
Yeah.
that too. So continue. So in your mind, you're like, okay, and just to be clear, so you're like, so what made you decide you wanted to engage atheists? You were telling yourself at the time, I'm going to do this to defend the church, but also what else was going on maybe that as
Well,
well.
and I think this is all, I mean, this is me reconstructing years later, but
Right.
this and piecing the story together. But I think, I, I think it just happened, especially with social media. You can go down rabbit holes and it just happens. And I think that's a lot of what was happening is that my spiritual taste buds were changing. I was just curious about these things. And if you had pressed me on it, I would have said, well, I'm trying to understand all these things. And that's probably what I would have said. But again, I think I the waters I was swimming in was gradually changing. And so I was more and more adopting a mindset that this is the end. Like there is no life after this life. And,
Okay,
I
so
was able to, yeah, go
that's
ahead.
fascinating to me. But before we get there, I want you to tell me what atheist materials were you engaging? Whose books were you reading? What YouTubers or podcasts you were listening to that were atheistic, that were most
Yeah.
influential to you at this time?
Yeah. I mean, Mormon stories for sure.
Well, not at
Um,
the time, just so you know, 2013, 2014, John Dillon is still a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so you can't say that's
right.
an atheist channel.
Right. And I didn't say that.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's but I was asking particularly what atheist books and podcasts you were engaging at this time.
Yeah. And so some of it was what's the name of that website? It's not LDS discussions, it's the other one. Um,
Is it Mormon discussions or
I think Mormon discussions.
yeah, I think
Mormon discussions was one. So on my phone, I'm not much of a reader.
okay.
It's only been in the last 5 years that I've really gotten into audiobooks is kind of how I've been able to get a lot more reading. I haven't read Richard Dawkins, but become familiar with some of his arguments. A lot of this is like social media, so like meme type level of arguments
Okay.
for atheism.
Now, did you read any of Christopher Hitchens' stuff vis-a-vis his thoughts on Mormonism?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Okay. So just so you understand, like when I got involved in started going atheism, I read basically all the works of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. It was actually
Yeah,
Samuel Harris's Letter to a Christian Nation, where I
right.
read a particular a part of it where he was saying for those of you who are progressives who believe, you're just giving cover to the fundamentalists and quit wearing your silly costumes and just come out of this thing. You're giving too much credence to these beliefs. And at that moment, I was like, okay, that's it. I'm an atheist. So when you say like at one point you said, this is it. There's no like, was that the mo like was there? Can you pinpoint a moment where you just like you read something
Oh
or you
yeah.
saw something and that was what caused you to lose your faith?
So again, what I'm describing pre 2014 is
Uh-huh.
just this gradual shift. Again, this wasn't like a decision like, listen, I'm going to explore atheism. I'm going to really dig deep and figure this out. It's just like this subtle thing. It's gradual, like the waters I was swimming in was gradually changing. But then two important things happened in December 2013. One is a mentor of mine. He's like a father figure, former bishop, former high councilman, left the church, and bitterly so. I mean, this guy was like my idol. I think, sometimes members of the church have our heroes. Like if Brother Smith knows that the church is true, then it definitely is, right? We have those kind of people. Well, he was one of them for me and a really influential person in my life. So when he left, and bitterly so, I mean, he moved out of state, left his family. I mean, it was a really big deal. I think at that time, I really felt like I wasn't on stable ground anymore. And this is against the backdrop of things that were gradually coming on, things I was feeling over time. And so that happened. And then the second, did you have a question?
Well, well, first of all, this is really interesting, but also
Yeah.
around what age were you at this time?
So I'd be 26.
Okay, so you're in your 20s and a
Yeah.
very close.
Returned missionary. I'm
And where did
married.
you
We have
serve
a
your
kid.
mission? Where did you serve your
Peru.
mission? Peru. Okay. You've served your mission and you have somebody that's really important in your life, somebody who's like a mentor, have a bitter divorce with the church and leaves, and that starts maybe making your foundation a little shaky at that point, would you say?
Yeah. And I was primed for it. I was like starting to skip elders quorum occasionally. It's not that I wanted to skip elders quorum. It's just, again, I was changing. I wasn't reading scriptures as much. I wasn't praying. Just I was changing over time, and sometimes members of the church mistake it for you wanted to sin or something stupid like that. It wasn't that. It was just my taste buds were changing. So he left, so I really felt like I wasn't on stable ground anymore. And then the second thing happened. I mean, the same month, December 2013, my father-in-law passed away, and he was a great man, and he was young. He didn't deserve to die. There were, still four kids living at home. And while he was, passing away in the hospital, they took him off of a breathing machine, gave him morphine to ease his passing. And all of his seven children and wife were in the room singing hymns to him, till we meet, that sort of thing. And I couldn't be there. I was in the hall with my 6 month old or something. I just pacing the hallway because that's when I realized, oh, I don't believe I'm going to see him again. And that's when it clicked. So that was my gradual, and then all at once, I think I was confronted with a fork in the road where I think before I was able to just keep going to church and just keep doing the normal routine thing. But then all of a sudden I realized, oh, I don't actually believe. And that was the first time I really knew that something had fundamentally changed. And so that was the catalyst for my faith crisis. This is December of 2013.
Okay, so these are the two things, and again, these are tragic situations that happen to you, and it really is affecting you. And At this time, has your mom, she of course she's had drug issues for a good part of your life as well, so you're dealing with the familial situation. So a lot of stuff. So a lot of this is really you've engaged in some atheistic stuff and you've listened to some things as to research, and you say that your taste buds have changed and the culture, the waters you were swimming in were different. Um, so that's kind of sets the groundwork, and then you have these two tragedies happen relatively close to each other, and then you would just have that moment in the hallway where you're just like, I don't believe in any of this, and I'm never going to see him again. What what was that like to have that feeling as you're holding your 6-month-old child?
Well, having a faith crisis, I mean, it's an identity crisis,
Hmm.
right? Because every answer you once had to all of your questions is no longer, I mean, again, it's this flip. It's everything I thought I knew, I don't know. I don't even know who I am anymore. Um, and it's as you may probably know, I'm sure you do, because you went through this a lot longer than I did. It's like, who am I? What am I even doing here? What is anything anymore? It was just a darkness and despair, and you go through kind of stages of grief. So you feel anger, you feel bitter, you feel resentment, and I went through kind of all those different phases of grieving until I reached some point of, I guess, stability where I accepted my new belief system. And so in, the following weeks and months, probably I listened to some criticisms or read some criticisms and, listened to some apologists. And at that time, the critics were the liars and the apologists were the honest ones. But it was like literally overnight, it's the critics that are the truth tellers. They're the ones who are saying it exactly how it is. The apologists are the, so it was like I was trying to preserve a certain narrative before, and then I was trying to preserve this new narrative now to justify my atheism. And so, yeah, literally for me, and I think some people have resonated with this because they'll have a family member or friend, and it's like, man, we were just at the temple like a month ago. And then all of a sudden they are like, they couldn't be further out. And it makes sense to me why that is. And that was kind of the case for me. It was just like very sudden. Everything I thought I knew wasn't the case, and now I'm learning with a fresh perspective about controversial church topics and church history and that sort of thing.
And before we go there, I just when I think about this, it's almost like you're taught this narrative, and this is not just Mormonism, but this is all religions in general, that there's like the Apostle Paul says that you won't go through more than what you can stand. I'm paraphrasing, but basically, the Lord won't give you more trials than what you can take. And there are times where I'm like, well, that doesn't verse doesn't seem to work for me sometimes. And what do you say that? What about your friend who committed suicide? Apparently, it was too much for them. Um,
Right.
so when it comes, like, for instance, you're taught a certain way that, well, the scriptures and the church will comfort you and take care of you during your times of need, and but it didn't seem like it was working for you at that time. And so you realize, like, hey, this isn't the answer. Them singing hymns to my brother-in-law isn't that this isn't going to change anything, and I'm probably never going to see him again. I mean, in other words, during when the rubber hit the road, it seemed like God wasn't there for you.
Yeah, I think that in a way, I think that's some of it.
Hmm.
You know, my father-in-law passing away in his mid 50s. I mean, I shouldn't say silly, but that was kind of this catalyst for the problem of evil, right? Where it's like, okay, my father-in-law passed away, but there are like starving children in Africa who, from the moment they're born to the moment they die, I mean, they're miserable. Like, what was God's plan for them, right? Why did my father-in-law pass away when, they weren't financially well off, like they needed him, and he was nothing but good. So why did this
Hmm.
happen? And
Yep.
so it was kind of this catalyst for more questions about my belief in God, the problem of evil, and these issues that philosophers have talked about for hundreds of years. But it was kind of my catalyst. Maybe before these questions weren't that important to me because I had the answers or something like that. But now it was like I'm encountering all of this with a fresh perspective.
Okay, so it's really interesting how you talk about the the problem of evil, because what's so fascinating, and I want to get back to you're exploring atheists and atheism as well, but what's so fascinating is that Bart Ehrman is one of the leading biblical scholars in the
Yeah.
world. He was a graduate of Moody Bible Institute, Wheaton College, so he had all the evangelical credentials you need. Top regarded biblical scholar. He does
Yeah, he's
not
brilliant.
leave. He is. He does not leave Christianity because of his research and his studies of Scripture. He left Christianity and religion in general because of the problem with evil. So that was that. Is that, would you say, is that's the number one thing, the one that caused you to become an atheist? Was that
Yeah, I would say so. I think the other one is what I now interpret as a misunderstanding of what the gospel is.
okay?
Um, so if you believe, and we get this in the church, and I think in Christianity as well, if I'm a good Christian boy, things are going to work out, right? Uh, I don't believe that. I think you could have a really, really challenging life from the moment that you're born to the moment you die. And even if you're a good Mormon boy or a good Christian girl, that's no promise. Like this life is random, it's chaotic. Like bad things happen, and they happen for seemingly no reason. And people do terrible, awful things. And so um, I think perhaps I had this idea that if I did things correctly or things right, that and you see this all over the place, right? If I, pray to find my keys, right? That's kind of like the silly one that people dig into. But if I pray to find my keys, then I'll find my keys, and God answered my prayer. Maybe. Uh, but I have this view now that I think this world's really hard, really chaotic. And I don't know if the promise of the gospel is that we'll find our keys. I think the promise of the gospels will have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And to me, that's infinitely more valuable than finding my keys or even my father-in-law living, right? Answers to prayers that he lived were answered. I equate this in my mind to like Lehi and Nephi. They traveled through the desert. They had to experience a lot of hardship and pain and trial to get to the promised land. And, they did. They ended up in the promised land. But I suspect that even if they never ended up at the promised land, they gained something far more valuable than a promised land. They gained a relationship with God. And so that's my current view now is that there is a God, and the most important thing we can do is have a relationship with him.
Okay, and so and I actually, when I went on Mormon Stories a few years ago, I was talking about my testimony, if you will, but then went to John and said, I do recognize though that right now, as we speak, there's a child being brutally raped and tortured, calling out to God, and seemingly there's
Right.
no answer. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
I always tell people, just as Buddhist saying, a true religion is a right relationship with reality. And I think that it's really important that we be grounded in reality, that we are in a privileged place being white males in America. Kind of, we're in a good space, right? We've had a lot of
Right.
things handed to us. And so it's really easy. That's why, like, even Calvinism is big with young white men in North America, because it just appears that it works so well for them. They must be
Mm,
predestined for this greatness and whatever
right.
and salvation. And when John Dillon, one of the most important things he ever said to me was, we all need to exercise epistemological humility. And I think that's really, really important that we do, because, yeah, this is a brutal, ugly world. It is, like I tell people, I said, the thing I share about with atheists, one of the things that I think atheists get right is they do recognize we live in a fallen world.
Right.
And they don't want to have anything to do with a God that gave us that world, and rather not
Right.
believe in a God. Understandable position. I actually tell people, look, if I put out all the facts, and we both have all the facts, and we look at them, and you walk away saying, I don't believe in God, I'm like, I totally get it. Like, the reality is
And
I
and
get.
that's how I feel.
Mhm.
That's I think I make it clear in the letter, but if somebody encounters the same data and history that I've encountered, I've come out on the faithful end where I'm a believing member of the church. But if somebody doesn't come out that way, I get it. I
Okay.
understand. I don't think they're crazy. I think it's very valid to run into these complex issues in church history or with just belief in God in general and not walk away believing. I totally understand that.
Well, I've had a person who's a well-known podcaster say on my Facebook page that all ex-Mormons are mentally ill. You don't think that's true, do you?
No.
Okay. And I showed that quote to Jacob Hansen, and he said, "Yeah, my siblings aren't mentally ill." So I
Right.
just want to get out there. I think it's really important that people in the faithful space, when they use such terms like that, they're not helping the discussion and they're doing harm. And I think it's really important that we be civil in our conversations with each other, and to use these broad strokes to stereotype people is not good. I think nuance. I think having epistemological humility, recognizing that we can come to different conclusions even if we look at the same evidence. One of the things when I had Aaron Ra on a few years ago, the well-known atheist YouTuber, who was, I think, one of the president of one of the atheist organizations for years, I told him off camera. I said, I'm a pro-atheist evangelical. And his eyes got real big, and he was like, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I think that for some people who have been spiritually and religiously abused and manipulated, sometimes even the concept of God can be triggering to them. And
Right.
so they almost have to become atheists in order for their own psychological well-being." Do you feel like you needed to become an atheist for a while just so because of what you were going through?
Maybe. Again, I didn't have a negative experience with the church.
Right?
Right. The church is big. There are lots of people, and some people have bad experiences, and it breaks my heart when I hear that because that wasn't my experience. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe a different question I could answer is, would my faith be what it is today, or as complete as it is today without X experience? I think undoubtedly no, it wouldn't have been. I think it's kind of obvious, but yeah.
Fascinating. So, okay, so and I want to get into the letter, but I think it's really important. I really want to get to know you, and I want the audience to get to know your faith journey because a lot of people are in this space. They're either on their way out, they're on their way in, they don't know what they believe, their shelf is broken, they're putting the pieces back together, they don't know whether there's a God or not, all that kind of stuff. That's a lot of people in my audience. And I think it's really important that each individual story is special and needs to be told so that people can understand where people are coming from. So this is 2013, but you said it was 2014 was when actually you became an atheist. So talk about what led up to that.
Well, I think December 2013, I became agnostic. I
Agnostic.
never went
Okay.
as far as as atheism, but yeah. So it was that was the moment, that was the catalyst.
Okay, that was the catalyst. And then you told your wife in 2014 that you no longer believe. Is that the
Correct. Yeah.
so what
I wear my heart on my sleeve. Like, at that point now, I'm like, I can't sleep. I'm researching things.
okay.
I can't eat at times. Like, it's consuming every moment of every day, every free thought, just to try to find some stable ground. And once I finally reached some like stable point where I feel like, okay, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, um, and what does that mean for my future? When I finally reached that point is when I wanted to confront my wife to let her know, like, I no longer believe. So let's talk about what that means, and figure this out. Did you have a question?
Well, continue, but I just for me it's I'm just curious, do you think she might have, because of your researching and you're not sleeping, she probably figured something was up, right?
I don't know.
Huh.
To be honest, I don't really know. I some men are able to kind of keep things in. I'm kind of one of those. Like, I
Okay,
can suffer
so
silently.
you were just doing this on your own. Nobody knew that you were going through this. You
Yeah,
kind of
it's very
figured it out.
lonely, right? Yeah.
Did you talk to any friends or family, or was the first person you talked to was your wife?
Uh, I mean, so we're talking about during this time frame. No, obviously over the years I've
Right.
talked to lots of people because there was a well. I'll just continue the story. So then, uh, finally, the day came to tell my wife, listen, I don't believe anymore. We need to figure out what this means. So we put our 1-year-old down. Um, we sit down in the living room, my heart's racing. I've got a lump in my throat. And then I just, because this is going to be disappointing. I've made promises to her. She has these expectations about what her life is going to be like. And now I'm going to disappoint her. And it's going to be really hard. But nothing was harder than like holding this in and being alone in what I was struggling with. And so I had to let it out. So I told her, I said, I don't think that I believe that there's a God. I said, I don't think, I was pretty convinced there wasn't a God, but regardless, that's what I said. I don't think that there's a God. And as I outlined the Light and Truth letter, her reaction really surprised me because she paused for a minute and she thought, and she turned to me and she said, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because this is where I found the most light and truth. And if you can find more light and truth outside of the church, I will follow you. That had a huge impact on me. And as I retraced my steps in retrospect, I think, for some months or years, right, I'm listening to apologists and critics, but like I'm support rah, rah, rah apologist. And then I'm listening to critics and I'm going rah, rah, rah critics. Like I'm trying to support a narrative. But when my wife said, if you can find more light and truth I say in that moment, but that framing, that mindset, all of a sudden it got rid of the narratives for me where I no longer needed to prove that the church was true or false. All I had to do was find if there was something better for me and my family out there. And so that changed everything for me. Obviously, she could have reacted really negatively, right? And some people do. When a spouse or family member confronts them about what they're feeling, instead of expressing empathy or listening, they get defensive. And gosh, I thought a lot about this. I'm not 100% sure what I would have done if she'd gotten really defensive. And then I had to dig in to justify how I feel. I don't know how that would have gone. And I don't like to think about it, I suppose. But
And did you even
she,
think that this could have ended your marriage?
oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, in fact, for me, I was wondering, is she going to ask for a divorce now or later? I mean,
Oh, okay.
I mean, that was my mindset is I don't want to get a divorce. I love this woman. I love our son and
Mhm.
I love what we've built, but it was built under different pretenses and expectations. And I understand if the direction I'm moving now is just, so that's what I thought the discussion was going to be, but instead it was, I will follow you.
Hmm.
And my wife's really weird. So when when I tell her this, she got really excited. She was like, "You're going to go on a journey and you're going to ask this." I'm like word for word quoting her. "You're going to ask the real questions, the hard questions, and you're going to learn something. And I'm so excited to see that and learn with you." And gosh, again, it's just so disarming. I no longer needed to support a narrative. All I needed to do was just find light and truth. And so that was my faith crisis, but then my faith journey, let's call it, started there, where now I'm learning, but I don't have an axe to grind anymore. I'm just learning. I'm just asking questions and I'm just curious. And that's kind of and that's why it's called the Light and Truth Letter, because I think this is really healthy framing. Faith crisis insinuates an urgent problem. And challenging gospel questions, sometimes they take time, they take experience, they take wisdom. Uh, we're not going to know all the answers all at once. And so by labeling something as a faith crisis, we insinuate that this isn't like a heart attack, right? This is an urgent problem you have to solve right now. But, life goes on a long time, and a faith
Yeah.
journey sounds way more fun than a crisis.
Well, and actually, I've been criticized because when I talk about so and so talks about their faith journey, well, that faith journey led them out of the church. That's still a faith journey, folks.
Yeah,
It doesn't the story isn't always going to be the happy ending you want it to be, or they end up
right.
in your place. Sometimes people end up in land at different places in their life, in different
Yeah.
churches, or not at
and
all.
I'm and I'm not finished. I mean, even though I
Yeah.
wrote a book, right? It's not the conclusion to my story. It's just a chapter in my story, and I will continued to learn and continued to grow and continue to pursue. And now it's fun, it's interesting, it's exciting, as opposed to what I was feeling for the months and years leading up to that point.
Okay, so let's just talk about now. So now your life is going on this trajectory where you're going to go on this faith journey and you're going to go and explore all these different arguments. You're going to look for truth wherever you can find it. What does that look like? What areas did you go? What books did you read? You say you don't read a whole lot of books, but what
I didn't
resources
back then.
what kind of resources were you looking at? Were you studying atheism? Were you studying different religions? What were you doing?
Yeah. So this is one of, I think, the misconceptions. This might have even been on Reddit. Well, and not just on Reddit. Like, I've had, did you explore Catholicism? Did you explore this belief system that I think is great? Or that's been some of the reaction. And I guess I understand the pursuit for more light and truth a little bit different. It's not so much find the most light and truth. It's, can you find something better? So for me, it's more, don't walk away from something until you found something better. Now, it is true. I actually really enjoy going to other churches. Last year, we went to a Messianic Jew Passover, and it was awesome. I loved it. I love going to Catholic Mass, and we have a and we have a local Catholic community that puts on this choir thing every Christmas, and I just love going to that. And so it's less to do with. So I explored everything I could and every worldview and every religious belief, but it's more like it slowed me down. I took a deep breath, and now I just got to learn out of just curiosity. I just got to explore, and it became just more interesting and fun than anything else. As far as coming back to belief, that had less to do with like concrete arguments, like what does this person say versus this person. I'm more of a thinker, and I sat on that question: is there a God, for a long time? And I talk about this a little bit in the letter, but I, as I'm thinking of the problem of evil, uh, there was a phrase that I heard in I don't know if you read that part of the book toward the end, the belief in God section.
Yeah, I haven't read the book cover to cover, so I don't
Okay.
think I read that section. So yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
please uh, let us know what that's all about.
Yeah. So in that section, I describe not an experience, but there was a phrase. This is second to last chapter toward the end. There's a phrase that I heard in a completely unrelated setting, but it kind of, I had like a Joseph Smith James 1:5 experience where it was like, it kind of rattled me to my core. And the phrase was, death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. And it I just thought, I turned that over and I thought about that and I thought about that and I thought about that, because that's kind of where my crisis started, right? Is that death is the end, and death is the worst thing that can happen, right? We're living, we're breathing, we get to have experiences, we get to have a body, like that's awesome. And to die, that's the worst thing that could happen, because then everything stops. There's nothing
The
else.
party's over, like Christopher Hitchens said.
The party's over, right?
Yeah.
And some people push back, like you could suffer and that's worse than dying. Okay, sure, yeah, I get it. Whatever. We can we can explore the nuance, but just the party's over, right? You're dead. And so when somebody said death is not the worst thing that can happen to us, it had this James 1:5 effect for me, where I just thought about that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so then I was thinking, and it was interesting. It was like missionary Austin was teaching agnostic Austin. Um, and I talked to my wife too, but I started like thinking through this and going, well, so let's say that there's an afterlife, and let's say there's eternity, and this life is a blip on this eternal timetable, like it barely even registers. And let's say we consented to come here to earth, even though we knew it would be impossibly hard. Even if you're white, male, living in the United States, everyone you know will die from sickness or tragedy, including you, right? So none of us escape the hardship that life provides. Um, but we raised our hand and we consented to it. but why would we consent to it? Well, there must have been like a trade-off, like I don't know, like a redeemer who promised us that if we came down, he would make it okay. And so I'm doing going through this mental exercise in my mind, and what I'm doing is I'm recreating the gospel story. And it was from the ashes of my disbelief that I'm recreating this story in my own mind. And so for the first time in a long time, I reached a point where it's not that I did believe, that I said, okay, yeah, I believe because I've gone through this thought exercise. It was more, I could see how I could believe, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Um, I recreated, or I constructed a God in my mind that finally made sense to me, that allowed me to believe in him. And so that's kind of where it started. And then further down the like Mormon rabbit hole I fell, it was like, man, critics have some really solid arguments that are
Mhm.
really challenging. But boy, some of the apologists have some really good counter answers, or vice versa. Apologists have some great evidence, but the critics have got some good counterpoints. And just the further down this rabbit hole I fell, it's just like, I don't think I'm going to be able to prove that the church is true or false.
Okay.
I think there's something, some space for belief. And so I think if there is a God, I probably have to decide to believe something, whether that's to be agnostic or to believe, either as a step into the dark.
So
And
why
so
does
I,
it need to resemble the faith that you grew up in? Like if you deconstructed your faith, why would you reconstruct it in a Mormon context, like with a preexistence? Like,
right, obviously that's more natural for me. Like missionary Austin's
uh,
teaching investigator Austin, right?
right, okay.
So, uh, so yeah, I don't try to admit, like, in fact, in the original Light and Truth letter, I think I said in that chapter that I was reconstructing the story of the gospel in the restoration, and it was the best explanation. But I actually changed it. Maybe it's the best explanation. I don't know. I haven't explored all of the explanations everywhere for the problem of evil. So then I changed it in the this recent update to it provided a reasonable explanation. And that's really all that I needed is, can I justify the existence of a God? I couldn't before, but I finally saw that actually there's a path forward where I actually could believe, not that I did, but I could. And then as I traveled down the Mormon rabbit hole, I was like, I don't think I'm really going to be able to prove this one way or another. I think I maybe just have to decide to believe something. And once I believe, then maybe God, if there's a God, maybe he could do something with that.
Okay,
It's
so
like, yeah,
we got this gap here. 2014, you tell your wife that you don't think there's a God, and then 2024, you put out your letter.
yeah.
So what does this 10-year period look like? At what point would you have said you started going back into believing again? Was this a year into it, or was it just last year? I mean,
No, no,
what does
yeah.
this look like?
It was like later 2020, 2014. So it's a few months later after turning this over for a few months where that was finally when I made a breakthrough. It's like, oh, okay, I think I could believe. Not that I did, but I think that I could. So yeah, a few months later.
And during this time, are you still going to sacrament? Are you
Yeah,
still so you never really made like a real clean break then from the
no,
church and your faith. Okay.
mm-mm.
And I think it's important for people to know that because
Yeah.
people have gone through so some critics would argue that you really never did deconstruct your faith. Would that be safe to say?
Yeah, and I think in the like when the Light and Truth letter first came out, I think that was the most knee-jerk response is basically that my faith crisis wasn't good enough or it wasn't as good as theirs. Probably, I'm sure. I mean, you were atheist for 13
Yep.
years, right?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I don't that's not something I'm trying to hide or anything. I think I really did leave. Like I was no longer a believer. I didn't remove my records from the church. Um, and as I'm exploring my faith and trying to figure this out again, I had to find something better. So until I did, I continued going to church, and I'd get uncomfortable at certain things, and my wife and I would talk. I think had I gone down that path, I mean, the Reddit, Pimo Mormon. I mean, that's probably where I potentially could have ended up, because I always thought of the church as a positive institution for people. I
Mhm.
thought it was a good place to raise a family. So maybe, probably what would have happened. In fact, this is what I thought was going to happen when I told my wife I no longer believed. I thought I would be Sister Fife's cool husband.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't come to church, but if you need a service done, like call brother or call Sister Fife's husband, like he's the coolest, he'll help. Like that's kind of what I envisioned
Mhm.
my life would be at that time. But yeah, no, I continued going to church, and finally reached a point months later where I realized I think I could believe. Not that I did, but I could. Yeah.
Okay, so and I think it's good to get this story out there because a lot of people, were intrigued by it. I'm intrigued by your story because, and again, I think, I mean, I don't, could I say that you were mentally checked out of your religion for a few months, and then you kind of found your way back in there? Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, mentally checked out. And then, though I was going to church, was an unbelieving member of the church for many months. Yeah.
Okay, so this was okay, so this is a period of months now. So now it's let's just talk about the letter. What made you, I guess actually a question that somebody asked for me to ask you is what is the purpose of the book?
Yeah. So I think um, I decided at some point after that I would become a believing member of the church. And it was awesome. I loved it. Like I didn't know anything, and I admitted that. Like I don't know anything, but I believe the truth claims of the restoration. I believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. I believe that there is a God, that there is a Savior. I don't know it. I don't know anything, but I believe that. And there's something about that was really fun, because then I no longer had to stand up and say I know without a shadow of a doubt. I
Yeah,
just was a believing member, and that was enough for me.
that was enough.
And
Okay. And keeping in mind, the
it,
CES letter didn't come out till 2015, right? Is that when CES
No,
letter?
it came out in 2013,
Oh, it
April
came
of
out in 2013.
2013.
Okay, I think I
Yeah.
read it in 2015. Just
Mhm.
just to kind of get back, did the CES letter have any effect on you having your faith crisis?
Not on having my faith crisis. I encountered it in 2014. So as I'm like exploring, okay, so what are people saying about these different things? That's when I first encountered it. It was in
Okay.
2014, but I wouldn't say it was like a catalyst for my faith crisis. Like
Okay.
I read it and said, "Oh my gosh, that wasn't really it."
And then at this time, of course, the gospel topics essays were starting to get released by the church.
Yeah,
Engaging those as well.
yeah, of course.
Okay, so you're engaging some of the critical stuff out there. Of course, even some of the stuff that's written by the church that some people at one time would have considered to be anti-Mormon literature.
Yeah,
I always tell people the Tanners, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, all they did was publish the gospel topics essays 50 years before the church did.
yeah, sure.
So, and did you engage Christian apologists? Did you engage the Tanner's work? Did you do like Mormonism Research Ministry or anything like that? Did you engage any of those critics?
I mean, I engaged a wide range of critics, either online or listening to podcasts. Was is still a favorite of mine. Going back to kind of so my story and my journey, because
Yeah.
so where do we end? How do we get to 2024? Right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
that's kind of
yeah,
the idea.
exactly.
Um, and so I decided that I could believe, and then I eventually made the decision I would be a believing member. I'm still exploring, I'm still learning, but I'm just a believing member of the church, and that's all that I am. I think that's enough, and I would have been totally content and thrilled to do that. And it's been great. I've loved it. I would say up until maybe 2020, I I wouldn't have been able to write a book. I just was like a guy who lost his faith who came back. I mean, it's not that interesting. It was, I think, 2 years ago. So this is now 2023. I kind of felt this urge that we needed to share more stories because there's Mormon stories and other platforms where people talk about how bad and awful the church was, and so they left and they're much happier now. And it's not to, by the way, disagree with that. That's their story, and so I don't disagree. But I was like, man, I feel like I'm not the only one who's left the faith and then came back, or had a faith crisis. I feel like we need to share more of these stories. So 2 years ago, I started making a website. It was going to be called the Faith Journey Project, is what I was going to do. And I was just going to collect stories from people who have either left the faith or had a faith crisis and then them coming back, just so there was a place where people could share their story. And it was sometime in 2023, I discovered Ashley Stone's podcast, the Comeback Podcast.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, dang, she's doing way better than I could possibly imagine. Like, she's doing a phenomenal job with this kind of thing. And so then I let go of that, and was just happy with my own little miracle, and that was enough for me. In fact, I'd asked her if I could come on the podcast, and I think they emailed me once, and then they get hundreds of emails, so I just got lost in the shuffle. And then it was a year ago. Honestly, I was thinking about it. It might have even been like today. It was like a Saturday in early February of last
Okay.
year. So almost a year ago, if not a year ago.
Well, this is the 1 year
I
anniversary. Okay.
I there were a number of catalysts. I'll just try to give you the short version. I heard somebody on some podcast somewhere talk about like the CES letter, anti-Mormon literature, and say, explore it, learn about it, dig into the sources, and you'll be fine. And I was like, I don't know if I share that same sentiment. I don't think that somebody could just like read the CES letter and then call it a day. Because of the way that it's framed, it's a really compelling story, right? If you just said, here's an anti-Mormon book, no Latter-day Saint would read it, or few would read it. But if it's like, this is a guy's journey, his faith story, questions that he asked, there's something more interesting and compelling about that. That's why the CS letters resonated for so long. And it's still, at least in my mind, like the most widely, publicized,
Mhm.
spread piece of document. And a lot of people have left the faith because of it. I was
Yep.
like, man, when I was outside of the church or considering leaving the church, I had a lot of questions. Jeremy Reynolds has a lot of questions, but I had a lot of questions too. It's like, I wish there was a letter out there, like somebody asking questions of the critics, because I had lots of questions. And then it hit me. I'm like, oh, I guess maybe I have to write this thing. So that's kind of where it started, was this desire to get my story out there and share a perspective from a faith promoting letter. And that's what the Light and Truth letter is.
And did you engage Jim Bennett's work on the CES letter, his response to it?
Yeah, I think maybe 2016, 2017, I'd read through his response. Uh, I think he revised it. His first edition was a little bit too snarky for me. Not
It
to,
was,
I know people love Jim Bennett's work, and so this isn't a dig on that at all. I think I read his first edition. He's changed it, but it kind of wasn't my cup of tea, personally. But yeah, I did see that, bamboozled by the CES letter. I've some of
well,
the other
from my
things out there.
understanding, he's heard from people in high places that it was his letter, that was the number one response that got people to go back into the faith. So it was effective.
Mm,
There's
yeah, so there you go.
and just so you know, Jim is good friends now with Jeremy Reynolds. They've broken bread together. They're good
Yeah.
buddies, and so I think that's a great story too. So a year ago today, basically, you decide you want to write this. So what was your first? Well, how does this look? What resources were you using? Obviously, you have the resources here in the back, but what was the impetus? What was your first thought?
Yeah, I
What
think
did you expect it to be this big? Is it?
no.
Yeah. Okay. So talk about the process.
No, and I have a full-time job. I'm a dad. I have a calling. Like, I'm not available. And so this was, in fact, I kind of look back and kind of like, I don't actually know how I did it, to be honest. I've never written a book. Um, but it consumed me. I mean, it was like every waking moment from February till the end of May, I was spent writing. It started with I'm just riffing, like I'm just like, what questions did I have? Like what things when I was considering leaving the church, like kind of troubled me about potentially leaving the church that I couldn't necessarily explain, right? So I had this spreadsheet and I had all these different ideas, and then I start kind of filling in and riffing and writing, and eventually, now there are some topics I just didn't know that much about. I know it's like a thing that is important to people on both sides, so now I'm like pulling in resources to better understand certain things. So this is like, in fact, for my birthday in May, early May of 2024, I asked my wife for my birthday, could I go to the church at 5 o'clock in the morning and not come home till 12 o'clock at night? Because I just needed like a hardcore day to write. And that's what I got for my birthday last year is my wife took care of the kids while I went to the church building, and just in a room, I was just manically typing away all day. But so that, yeah, February to May is when I wrote, I guess, the first draft. Then I sent it to about 10 friends and family to get their feedback, editing, you missed this or cut this or that sort of thing. So then I spent all summer editing, revising, changing, updating, and then finally published, yeah, like that second, third week of August. And I was planning originally to do a second edition like in 2026 because I'm just a guy. I know some people have thought this is some shadow operation from Fair or Scripture Central. It's not. It's just me. But I always figured I would make mistakes or just get some things wrong. And so I always intended to do a second edition in 2026 where I'd correct that and probably trim down because it's long. So try to trim it down as well. But then there were just some things that were too egregious to not include. So I decided, and that's kind of what I did October, November, December, was reworking it a
Okay.
bit and editing and fixing, like Jerry Grover in the edition I think that you have, I talk about the lock stone and the Stella stone. He talked about he messaged me like I really don't think that these are legitimate Mesoamerican artifacts. I'd highly recommend you take it out. So just stuff like that. So I felt
Okay. So
compelled to do a refresher first edition, which just came out last month.
and I just want to know what kind of, when you said you sent out 10 copies to 10 people, did you have any scholars or anybody from Fair Mormon or anybody from BYU do any kind of peer review on it?
No, keep in mind I'm nobody, right? Probably today, if I asked
Yeah.
Robert Boylan, right? I'm just if I asked somebody or asked you, hey, could you read through this, give me some feedback? You'd probably listen today, but a year ago, nobody would listen. I did ask a number of scholars and academics if they'd be willing to. I didn't want to send them a 200-page thing, so I'd say, could you review this section for me? And it was crickets. I don't want to name names, and I don't blame them. I'm nobody. They probably get lots of emails, so yeah, I didn't get any or much feedback. I got a couple of people who were kind of subject experts to give me some thoughts on very narrow sections.
Okay. So
Yeah.
this is, so you didn't really receive any help from any outside sources. This is all your stuff. And where were you getting your information from? Was it primarily from the internet and just going on apologetic websites? Were you engaging, like, for instance, Dan Vogel's works, Rich, that kind of, and some of the critical stuff, some of the
Yeah,
research
I've
done?
listened. I actually really like Dan Vogel. I really
Okay.
like his work a lot. Everything I've interacted with his is online. I haven't read his books or anything, but I've really enjoy some of his work. Yeah, so I pulled in from a number of different places. I mean, it's all cited. I mean, there's
Mhm.
over 500 sources. And yeah, a lot of it kind of internet based. The website, if you can click on different sources and easily find additional resources on the website or on the PDF if you're opening it up on a computer.
Okay, so let me just pull up a question that was on Reddit real quick. And I posted this earlier this week. I just want to give a shout out to all my friends out in the Reddit. I am iconoclastic skeptic. I think you all realize that as well. And just so you know, when I started this account, I did this Reddit account in 2019. So I would have still, my name, iconoclastic skeptic, that definitely would have still characterizes me on some level. But this was I started this as an atheist. That was my 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 thing. But
In 2019?
yep, yep. When I first started engaging on Reddit, when I actually made a Reddit account,
Okay.
I actually was going to the
Yeah.
actual Reddit since 2015. Um, this was the most voted on question, so I'll just read this to you from Ricardo Roeder. Austin addresses his letter to critics, but mostly seems focused on keeping folks in the boat who have been influenced by critics of the church and are more quietly moving towards the outside. Has he considered either revising his letter to be addressed to them rather than to the critics directly, or has he considered revising the substance of the letter to more directly interface with those to which the letter has been addressed?
Yeah, I've heard something along those lines, like why is it addressed to the critics? There are different types of critics, and that's what's challenging about writing a book. Like, do I say some critics every single time I'm referencing the critics? But there's, some critics that are in previous generations, they just would have become less active members of the church, but now they're kind of lower end critics. There's like really naive members who then become really naive critics, right? That's a different level. Then there's like the intellectual critics. They know their stuff, like they've got it down pat with an axe to grind. Like they are trying to take people out of the faith and trying to, discredit and embarrass the church. Then there's, like I would put Dan Vogel in a category intellectual critics that are just they're curious, right?
Yeah, they're
They don't.
scholars. They're just doing
Yeah,
scholarship, and
yeah,
they're not.
yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and they're not in it. They don't have an axe to grind in the sense that they just want you. This information. You do with it as you please. So I think that's where a large portion of your critical scholarship is in that area. Now, keeping in mind that a lot of scholarship that was done in the past, like Brent Metcalf, he did some great work, but then gets excommunicated from the church. And I told him, I said, you were born 20 years too early, because if you had
Right,
been born 20 years later and done this work, you'd be at BYU. So the thing is like this idea of what critics of the church are saying, or what anti-Mormon literature has
right.
changed. What was critical, what was anti-Mormon, is now being published by the church, including in Saints. And also, just to give you some context here, I was flying on one of my trips to Utah, and I was sitting next to a Southwest Airlines pilot who lived in Idaho. And he said during COVID times, and again, this is the example of kind of like naive critics or naive believers.
Yeah,
Um, this guy, he never really, he was just kind of spoon-fed church history through what he'd hear in church. He gets the first edition of Saints because he had time on his hand because it was COVID times and he wasn't working. And of course, he's a pilot, so he's smart. He said, "I read Saints, and I that made me leave the church." Was the history that he was exposed to in reading Saints.
right.
So, what does that say about what's the church is putting out there as well? What kind of, and then again, that's he's older, he comes from a little bit older generation. And so it just goes to show that, what's so fascinating now is that over the course of the last few years, the church has been trying to get out ahead of this, and kind of inoculate the members from a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, the church was late to the game for sure. Yeah, I don't disagree.
And do you think that that could also lead to people having faith crises? It's not so much the critics, it was the stuff the church wasn't telling the people.
Oh, undoubtedly. I think there's a natural problem in the church, and critics expose this, where church is more devotional. We're not going to spend weeks every year in Sunday school scrutinizing the different seer stone accounts and when was Joe Smith using the seer stone versus the Urim and Thummim. That's just not what church is for. And so what you get at church is Joe Smith translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God.
Mhm.
And that's just a natural limitation at church. And also, the church will canonize different things, right? It's like the seer stone, just to keep picking on it. It was like this highly cherished relic early in the church. And then when Joseph Smith didn't canonize it in the 1838 edition of Joseph Smith history, it just kind of naturally get forgotten with over the generations and over time. So then now it's a surprise to people. And so there's some natural limitations in church, but I also think that the church was late to the game online. And I think my generation, millennials, are just getting just wrecked. I think in future generations, I think will do a much better job. Yeah, sure, you can call it inoculation, just transparency and having more complete discussions around some of these controversial issues. But yeah, I think it's like, I don't know. I thought missionaries were perfect. No one told me that. No one said no one said that
Yeah.
missionaries were just 19-year-old boys or 18-year-old boys. But then when I got to the MTC, I was shocked. They were just 19-year-old dudes,
Yeah.
like lighting their farts on fire, dudes. Like that's and it
Exactly right.
was like it was like a not a faith crisis, but it was like a, oh, missionaries aren't perfect. And it like blew my mind. And no one told me that, but there's just sometimes presuppositions we bring to the table that end up harming our faith. So yeah.
Hmm. Okay. So I want to ask you, what would you say is the strongest argument that you make in your book?
The longest chapter is called Fruits of the Church.
Okay.
It just outlines how good it is for people to be members of the church. Certainly, people have bad experiences. Obviously, that's true, and not everyone has a good experience. But by and large, when you're looking at the macro data, members of the church are doing really well. They live longer, they divorce at lower rates, they're healthier, they report, they're happier according to self-reporting, and so that's I think the strongest argument is that members of the church are doing really well. And I think one of the questions my letter subconsciously answers, um, what I felt like, and part of the reason I wrote it to critics is I felt like when I interacted with critics, I was they were trying to like get me into a corner where I felt like there's no way that I could believe. Um, and then eventually I saw a path forward. And I became disappointed with critics for not appropriately identifying that it is reasonable to believe. Now, that doesn't mean you have to believe. Like you may find the same evidence I do and say, oh, that's not really compelling to me. And I get that. I understand that. But I think some critics want to make it seem like you're stupid if you believe. And so that's a lot of the reason why my letter's addressed to critics. I don't think it's stupid to believe. I think there's some really compelling, not overwhelming, not beyond a reasonable doubt. I think there's some really interesting, compelling reasons to believe. One of them being it's really good for you to be a member of the church, to have a community, right? Um, that's not stupid. That's a rational, reasonable reason to be a believing member of the church and of a faith.
You
Because the
know,
same thing applies to Christianity.
I just want to make it very clear to you that I was just talking to, I am friends with tons of atheists. Okay.
Yeah,
I've had Michael Shermer on, the editor of Skeptic Magazine. I've had Aaron Ra on. I've had on Bryce Blankenagel, who I was just talking to on the phone last night. I've had, I talk to them all the time, and I've not one time has an atheist said I was stupid for believing. So I'm just saying my experience with critics is not necessarily that. Now that can happen. That is out there. But on the level that I'm at with them, n none of them go to me and say you're an idiot for being a believer, Steve. So they respect the faith from where I'm coming from, just so you understand. But
yeah,
that's partly because they see that I did truly deconstruct my faith, really did, and deconstructed the scriptures, deconstructed God. I tell people I did went through this deconstruction process, but it turns out God deconstructed me during this period of time that I needed to go through. So, and
yeah,
then it humbled me and made me into the person that I am. And I'm actually grateful to atheism and to atheists for the works they've done. And I think it's a really important
yeah,
engagement. In many ways, it's Western-based atheism is really just a form of Protestantism taken to its logical extreme, right? It's like
mm, yeah.
that's how I look
That
at it.
makes
So
sense.
I go to atheists and just say, "Welcome to the fold, fellow Protestants." That's kind of how I see it. But I want to speak. I want to speak to some of the critical pushback that you have been getting, and most notably via Radio Free Mormon's podcast that he's been doing with Kolby Reddish. I just wanted to maybe just ask you, what are you what maybe was there anything that you wanted to kind of maybe address on some of the stuff? I know don't want to do tit for tat, but maybe just a general thing that you want to say about what the work they're doing.
Yeah, I found it interesting so far. I wonder how much I owe them because their feedback will be really helpful for the next edition to just improve some of the ideas and just do a better job. Again, I didn't have any academic friends in the space, and so I hope to get more help in the future. But I mean, they're going chapter by chapter, line by line, sometimes word by word critique of the Light and Truth letter. And so they're kind of pulling to the surface some of the better arguments, the weaker arguments. I don't know if they emphasize the better arguments as much as I would hope. But regardless, I've, as weird as it sounds, I've appreciated what they're doing. I get what they're doing. So yeah, that's kind of my knee-jerk reaction is thank you for the service.
Okay, so you actually appreciate the work. So now when you do revisions, are you going to give them credit for pointing out, some of the stuff,
Well,
things like that?
I told Kolby, I said I in a YouTube comment, or I don't remember where we were interacting, but I said something like, "Yeah, I've appreciated all the feedback just to button up the arguments. Would you like writing credit in the next edition?" And he said, "No, thank you." So no, I guess is the short answer.
Well, I guess though that if maybe you could point out, like maybe even in the preface, you could just say, "And I want to thank Radio Free Mormon and Kolby Reddish for doing their line by line critique of my work that has certainly informed my work." At least give them credit that way. That might be a way to do it.
Yeah, in the January 2025 edition, I wrote in the beginning, I said, so one of the pieces of feedback that I got is it's unclear who the critic is. Right. I address it to the critics, but who is the critic? Because there are former members of the church who left because of sincerely held doubts.
Mhm.
Right. Are they the critic? Right. The people who just left because they don't believe. And so I clarify in that I said, thank you to those who identified the need to clarify who the critic is. And so I've done that somewhat already, but yeah, I'm excited to take a break from the Light and Truth letter. I spent, again, like every waking moment for 10 months working on it. I started writing my next book this week, actually.
Oh, what's that?
I'm not going to do it nearly as fast. I'm just going to take my time as more of a hobby than I did with the Light and Truth letter. But yeah, I'm excited to take a break. And then next year, I plan to revisit it, and I hope to trim it down because it's
Okay.
long.
But this book that you just started writing, what can you mind previewing it? Tell us what it's about.
Yeah, and then you'll use this against me if I don't actually publish it. But maybe this will motivate me to
I
finish. How
won't
about
use it
that?
against you. I understand
I
how
started
somebody can.
writing it this week.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I so far the working title is Journey, Not Crisis.
Uh-huh.
You and I talked about a little bit how faith crisis insinuates an urgent problem, whereas challenging gospel questions is just part of life. Like
Mhm.
this life is a journey to discover the divine, discover who we are. And so it's not a sequel to the Light and Truth letter, but it's a natural continuation of my journey. But hopefully it helps folks who, one of my hopes for this next book is for people who are faithful believing members and have somebody who's having a faith crisis, help them understand what that family member is going through, or loved one, so they can be more empathetic. That's one of my hopes for this next edition is go on a journey with your loved one, right? I'll walk with you, right? And so,
Okay.
as opposed to I've got to defend my beliefs and I got to fight back. One of the most uncomfortable things, I'm sure it's happening, and I don't love it, but one of my best friends, his wife, isn't a member that she left the faith, and her family, they don't know who I am. They took my book and kind of threw it at her and like, you gotta, and try to, yeah, just threw it at her like, see, you've got to believe. And that makes me so uncomfortable because that's not what it's for. It's not to overwhelm your family members into belief. And so when my friend told me that, I was devastated because that's not what that's for. So hopefully this next book will address that demographic a little bit better, like believing members who want to help their loved ones.
Okay, well, that's that. I think it's good that you're getting this kind of feedback, so you're understanding the impact and how people are going to take different takes off of it, as well, and maybe
Yeah.
not, maybe misuse it in a way that was not intended. So that's, and of course, when you put something out there, you don't have any more control over it. Now it's out there. it's in the bloodstream and how people,
Yeah, I figured it would happen.
Mhm.
Yeah, I figured it would happen, and I don't remember which interview, but I said this isn't a faith brick that you throw at your relatives. But that's about all that I could say. But hearing it from like a friend of mine
Then it
was
becomes,
disheartening. I didn't love that. And he said, I mean, look at the intro. Like his wife said, like I'm going to go on a journey with you, and that kind of turned her family around on the topic a bit. Like, okay, we need to relax. I think that's what kind of gave me the idea. Like maybe I need to explore that a little bit more and speak to that demographic because my wife was awesome. Not everyone has a Tikla Fife that they're married to that's really supportive and curious and open-minded like she was. And so hopefully this next book will help some of those people, hopefully.
okay, that's great. Well, and I just wanted to ask you, and we're going to wrap this up. It's going a little longer than I anticipated, but this is a great conversation. I appreciate you
Sure, yeah.
down and doing this. Um, one of the things that was pointed out to me is that, Kolby Reddish and RFM have been really, going through your work and pointing out issues and like the issues with Nahum and stuff like that and their sources and all that.
Hmm.
You've been on many other faithful podcasts, and that you've never, it doesn't seem like they're doing that due diligence to your work that they're doing. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, I mean, I think the same reason as you. You probably skimmed my letter, but probably not enough to be able to provide me a line by line critique. Again, I didn't know anyone a year ago. I'm sure if I'd sent this manuscript to Neil Rapley or something like that, he could have torn it apart and provide me lots of really meaningful feedback. I hope next year, because I know more people now, that I could get a lot more feedback, and I'm really looking forward to that. But I mean, it's not that big of a mystery. Their intention, in my opinion, is to discredit the Light and Truth letter and embarrass me. And so, of course, they're going line by line, word by word. So they're going to find things no one else will. I think
Okay.
so. It's not that big of a mystery to me. But if I asked Sarah, Sarah Allen, I said, Sarah, I need you to go through this. I need you to rip it apart. Tell me everything that's wrong. Please spend a month on it or whatever the case is. I'm sure she could have some really meaningful feedback.
Yeah. Well, this has been an interesting journey that you've been on. I want to say that I understand why some critics have been critical of the work just because I if let me put it this way, because of my relationship with Christian apologetics and how that caused me to lose my
Yeah.
faith ultimately, it would be, and again, this is why I think our journeys are different. If I were to write a book and then use this as a source, I would be disingenuous to where I was as a fully deconstructed person, right? So I would never go back and use his materials, Josh McDowell's materials, to defend Christianity. So when I got your Light and Truth letter and you were using like a lot of Fair Mormon and Scripture Central and stuff like that as sources, I was like, I don't think he went through the same deconstruction process that I did. I just want to kind of give you my perspective on that. And so for
Oh,
a lot of people,
yeah. Obviously, our experiences are different. I also think the Light and Truth Letter is not an academic treatise of all the best arguments for and against the church, right? That's a different letter. This is a faith promoting letter. And so, yeah, of course, I'm naturally focusing on. Here's kind of the way I see it. 10 years ago or 11 years ago, I guess, there were certain things that critics were harping on. And then the more that I dug in and the more that I learned, the more disappointed I grew. I'm like, man, there's a lot of really compelling information here that's also positive as well. That I don't feel like it's getting emphasized or given enough credit to. And so it's written to the critics as a means to talk about some of the things that I don't feel like they give enough credence to. And so, yeah, I think you're not wrong. Our stories are different, and I could very well write a different letter, I think, in a different lifetime. Like if there was no CES letter, I probably could write a different book saying, man, there's stuff that the church isn't doing a good job of and not emphasizing enough and things that apologists fall short on. I could have written something like that, but that's not this book.
so one of the things I think and again, this is stuff that people have been bringing up, so I think it's important to be addressed, that you went on Word Radio and basically said that you were trolling the critics by putting in misleading information in the book. Um, if somebody is a believer and is reading your book and then is using your arguments, what, and then they get devastated by a critic because of that information that you were putting in to troll critics. What do you say to that critique?
Yeah, well, I wish I hadn't have said that. Let me put it that way. I think one thing that my wife told me about early on, and this is, I think, the biggest mistake that I've made, is I've been really inconsistent with my messaging. One moment I'm on Twitter with like a meme to make people laugh, and then the next moment I'm, you know, trying to listen to former members who have sincerely held concerns and express my empathy. And those are just two different things. And so I think that's my biggest regret, is that I've been really inconsistent with kind of how I've in my messaging. And so uh, I wish I hadn't used the word troll, because first of all, it's not accurate. Like, that's not, if I was putting in something misleading to troll the critics, then that would be really bad. That's not what I was doing. Zosimus is like a legit piece of evidence that people use to support the Book of Mormon. Now, you may believe it's really valid or not. That's fine. I get that. My whole point in including it in the Light and Truth letter, where it is in the Light and Truth letter, is a lot of the critics' uh, arguments against the Book of Mormon revolve around like environmental parallels between View of the Hebrews, the First Book of Napoleon, the Late War. So I'm just using kind of what critics have used as compelling theories in a different situation with Zosimus, as like, if you believe parallels are strong evidence, well, what about Zosimus? And so when critics week one on Reddit gave View the Hebrews a pass and First Book of Napoleon a pass, and they criticize Zosimus, it's like, I feel like you're showing your colors by doing that. I called it a troll. I wish I hadn't have done that. So I think it's been mischaracterized that I was being dishonest. That's not what it was. I think unkind would be very accurate, and I'm unhappy that that's how things played out. It is what it is. I can't change it. I wish I hadn't have said that, but
Okay.
I think in the future I want to be better at being more consistent with my messaging.
Fair enough. And I'm going to just ask you like a kind of like an epistemological question about, like, I know you're defending the Book of Mormon and that, and your church, which is fine. You said this is a faith promoting thing. I just want to ask you, like, as an outsider, okay, who is studying the entirety of the Restoration, not just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but all the different sects and manifestations and stuff within the Restoration. And recently, I just had on a guest. His name was Matthew Gill, and he claims to have found plates
Yeah.
in England, and he claims that this is the Adamic language on the cover here. And he's a prophet, seer, and revelator of the restored branch of Jesus Christ. And he and actually it was my viewers, and again, thank you, viewers, who helped raise the money for getting this published in a beautiful leather-bound edition. And he basically claims to have written translated records, both plates and scrolls, using the Urim and Thummim to talk about the history of Stonehenge, the people who built Stonehenge. So
Yeah.
arguably, he actually has archaeological evidence that he could point to for this book. He can take you to all the places, and he's going to do a picture book, taking you to all the places where all the events happen that allegedly happened in this book. What do you, as a Latter-day Saint, and also as an outsider, how am I supposed to differentiate from the claims that Matthew Gill is making versus those that Joseph Smith is making?
Yeah, good question. I think as soon as you were describing what that is, my knee-jerk reaction was like, "Oh, how cool is that?
I know
That's really interesting.
it is.
Like, that's something I want to like learn more about." I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything, but
Yeah,
that's
and
really interesting. I'd love.
it's fully illustrated. And so people, if you watch my
Yeah.
Mormon Stories interview, it was as an 8-year-old boy coming across the paintings of Arnold Freiberg in a Book of Mormon at a Marriott hotel that first engaged me with the Book
Okay.
of
Yeah.
Mormon. I imagine 8-year-old boy looking at this stuff. Look at that. Come on. This is cool stuff, right? So I So yeah, yeah, and again, and within the context of the restoration, there is this anticipation that other records would come forth of other civilizations testifying of Christ. So why, how should somebody, how should I engage this, and how do you engage it? Like you said at first, like this is cool.
Yeah, that's my like knee-jerk reaction. I'm like, I gotta get a copy of that. That sounds so cool. Like I want to learn more. Because I this is like the first I've heard of it. I saw I think a YouTube video of yours where you talked about Stonehenge. So I probably have to watch that video, but or maybe you teased it on Facebook. I don't remember, but
Yeah, I did both. I just released it this past week. Yeah.
that's kind of my knee-jerk reaction. And same thing with some atheist arguments too. Like when an atheist brings up like a perspective I've never thought about before, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I
Hmm.
never really thought of it that way. And instead of it invoking like a crisis, like, oh my gosh, is this an ancient translation? Or oh my gosh, is there not a God anymore? Instead of it being a crisis every time, it's just like, man, that's interesting. I'm excited to learn more. I don't know the answer to that. I'd love to just think about that and study that and learn more about it. That's kind of my approach to this day. I have just a lot of curiosity about these sort of things.
And what would you say, just as we wrap this up, what would you say is the strongest argument you've heard against either your work or against the church?
I think which one? My work or the church?
It's either the strongest argument you've heard, I guess,
I think
since you've done this.
the strongest argument against the church, I think, is the fallibility of leaders. Um, I think some members of the church believe prophets are perfect, right? They're infallible. And
Mhm.
no one told them that. It's not in our doctrine, but it's just, again, I thought missionaries were perfect. I thought bishops were perfect. And then I was a counselor in a bishopric. I'm like, oh, they're not perfect. And I thought it's just it's like this presupposition we bring to the table, and so I think that is one of the most challenging doctrinal gospel issues: is what do you do with men who are fallible leaders? If this is God's church and God, there's revelation, right? That then how do you reconcile that? And frankly, for some folks, it's the racial ban. That was their, I guess, shelf, I guess we can call it. Like that was their limit of prophet fallibility. And I totally get that. I
Yeah.
understand that. I think that's the most challenging gospel problem and gospel question is how much fallibility is acceptable?
And I guess to follow up, then, what did you consider to be the strongest argument against your book?
Uh, in the first section, I talk about manipulation and fallacies, identifying, broadly speaking, like critics who use manipulation techniques and fallacies to make their argument. And then critics have turned around and say, aren't you using some of these same arguments in your letter? The week before I published the Light and Truth letter, that was like my biggest, like, should I do this?
Hmm.
Should I publish this? Because I think that's the thing that I was most concerned about. What I settled on, and this may be unsatisfactory, and I understand that, it's a faith promoting letter, right? I'm putting my flag in the ground. It's not an academic treatise of all the best arguments for and against. It's a faith promoting letter. There's naturally things that I'm emphasizing, things that I'm not emphasizing. I understand that. I think the difference in what I've come to is, in my experience, critics, when they make their argument, and critics, again, we're talking range of critics. There's different types. Some type of critics paint the story and picture that puts you in, I call, a faith corner, where you feel like there's no way that I could believe, like there's no way out, there's no path forward. And so things like the CES letter and other material like it's looking to dismantle faith and put you in a corner where you're left with no other option. Whereas my letter, it's not trying to prove that the church is true. All it's saying is, hey, there are some rational reasons to believe. You may not be convinced by it, uh, but here is what I've found over the years and questions that I've asked, and now it's up to you. And so for me, I think that's kind of the big difference is I'm not trying to tell people what to believe. It's more putting down some tiles for people to step on to find stable ground. And they may read my letter and still say, this is not convincing to me. And I respect that. Um, but I think sometimes critics and we'll say apologists talk past each other,
Mhm.
where I got an email once from somebody who's left the church. They said, I went to XYZ Divinity School to prove that the church was true, and I came out an atheist, right? I think sometimes critics, the way they're framing the argument is, must I believe? Or basically, is there definitive proof of the truth claims of the restoration? Whereas my letter is more asking, is it reasonable to believe? So I think sometimes critics and apologists talk past each other because we're asking different questions.
So you describe your Light and Truth letter as being a faith promoting book, right?
Yeah.
What would you describe the CES letter?
I've a faith dismantling book.
And you would call it a faith dismantling book. Okay. That's how you look at
Correct.
it. Okay, so this is the counter to that in one sense. Okay. Well,
Yeah,
Austin,
it's not a debunk. My letter's not a debunking of the
no.
CES letter. It's more like a reaction to it,
Okay.
is what I've described.
And have you ever been in touch with Jeremy Reynolds?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Yeah, I know he's
He's
Hartford.
he's kind of quiet now,
He is.
which honestly I get it. After a year of doing this and like responding to comments, and like I get dozens and dozens of emails, and somebody's always got a new book that they want me to read or a new podcast, and it's like this. You probably get it worse than I do. It's
Yeah.
like this never-ending thing, and this isn't my career. I'm just a guy who wrote a book, and he's the same. He's a guy who had some serious faith concerns, and then he wrote a letter, and now he's provided all his debunkings. Like, he's put a lot of energy and work and time into this, and I respect that. He just wants to be done. Like, he doesn't want he doesn't want to be dragged into this, and I understand that. So no, I haven't had interactions with him. He seems like a nice enough guy.
So Austin, this is the basically the 1 year anniversary of you starting on this journey.
Yeah,
How has this helped your faith journey? And what have you learned about yourself?
that's a good question. I've had a number of really powerful experiences writing this letter. um, I guess I've learned that I like writing. I didn't know that. I really enjoy writing. There have been certain sections that I've been kind of stumped on. It's like, I don't know what to say about this. Like, I think I've said everything that I wanted to say, but I have a family member who thinks that I need to say more. And so then I've, in prayer, like, what else am I not saying? And then the next day I'll have an incredibly revelatory experience where like the words just flow, and it's like I'm like in the zone, this thing that I was stumped on. So I've had a lot of spiritual experiences writing. It's been really gratifying to see that it seems to be helping some people. I've gotten lots of emails. In fact, I've had a I have a number of email interactions where we're going back and forth. There's a guy I call my pen pal, uh, where we send voice memos back and forth, where we just talk and just have discussions. And he's agnostic. He doesn't believe. He just came back to church for the first time like 2 weeks ago in years. Um, and anyway, so I don't know if I answered your question there, but it's been an enjoyable experience. It's been very challenging. It's been very hard. Again, 6 months ago, I was nobody. I love anonymity, and I like being unknown.
I
I
get
didn't
it.
want to put my name on it because then my name gets dragged through the mud, and I knew, well, either this was going to flop, which if it did, I would have been so relieved. That would have been amazing.
Uh-huh.
Or and I didn't expect how much this took off, and seems to really resonate with people negatively and positively. And so that's been challenging, but also, rewarding in a way.
I just actually one quick question that's come to mind. I think you've sold over 5,000 copies of this. Is that about right?
Yeah, something like that.
And people are wondering, like, where is this money going? Are you tithing on it, or what? Just so people know financial transparency.
Yeah. So it's free to read online. It's a free PDF online as well. Free HTML version. I paid a programmer a lot of money, thousands of dollars, to put
Okay.
it up online, and then I pay him lots of money to make changes when I need changes done.
Okay.
I paid somebody on Fiverr to publish an EPUB version for Kindle twice because I'd had the old edition and the new
Okay.
edition. And I knew people would want a physical copy, so I self-published on Amazon. If you go to my royalty page, it literally says zero. But I
Okay.
do make royalty. I actually don't understand why I sometimes make a royalty. My only guess is if somebody doesn't have Amazon Prime and they
Oh,
pay for shipping, I think Amazon gives me a small cut of that, I think.
okay.
Anyway, so of the 5,000 books that I've sold, I've made about $500.
Okay.
So like 10 cents a book, give
So
or take.
you're not getting
I
rich off this.
actually, no, I actually hasn't even hit my account yet. I was looking to see if I got a tax form from Amazon and I didn't. And I was like, why didn't I get a tax form? And then I looked and I put in my bank info wrong on Amazon. And so I
Oh,
actually haven't even gotten a cent yet. I just fixed that like 3 days ago. But I told early on Reddit, I mean, it's a knee-jerk reaction, like people thinking you spend a lot of time, energy, and effort into this thing. It must be like a money making endeavor. It's not, but that's just sometimes people's knee-jerk reaction. But somebody early on was criticizing, they could not believe that it was like I was making no royalties. And they end up being right. I make hardly any royalties. But anyway, I said, if I make any royalties, I'll donate it to a good cause. So I haven't done that yet, but I'm happy to donate $500 to a good cause.
great. Good to know. Well, Austin, as we wrap this up, I want to thank you for coming on the program. Really appreciated you sitting in on this conversation. Were there any final words you'd like to share with the audience?
Oh, man, that's a good question. Let me look at some of my notes here, see if there's anything I wanted to talk about. No, I feel like we covered it. I really appreciate you having me on, and hopefully this is interesting, helpful, and I'm sure critics they're not going to love me after this interview, and that's fine. That's okay. I get it.
Well, I know one of the first people that will be watching this will be Kolby Reddish, and he will
Yeah,
then
yeah,
be
of
coming
course.
onto my program to respond. And then hopefully down the road, if it happens, it happens. Maybe I can get you both on a panel discussion and have a civil conversation about your work. Austin, thanks for coming on today. Folks, we're going to have links in the description to everything we talked about today, to his book. Also, I wanted to share with people Austin's website. So let me pull that up real quick. And here we go. So here is the lightandtruthletter.org. And this is the website that you can go to. There's a lot of interesting information on here. You can actually read the book here as well. You can download the Light and Truth Letter. So it's all free. And there's a link that if you want to purchase on Amazon, it's there. So check out lightandtruth.org. And also
I
we'll have
recorded
link.
an audiobook as well.
So we could, and did you record it with your voice?
I recorded it. Yeah, I love audiobooks. That's finally what got me into like reading is audiobooks. I thought I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't have an audiobook version. So I spent the better part of like October recording the audiobook. But yeah, that's on there too.
Oh, good to know. So there's an audiobook as well, folks. So, and then I'll have his website in there. And we'll have links in the description for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel. We have them there as well. Couldn't do it without you. Do greatly appreciate the donations to the channel. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.